A king's bargain. Valeria Marchesi had always known that in their world, debts were paid in flesh. But when her brother stole from the wrong man, she learned the hard way his debt was now hers. Niccolò Moretti leaned against her kitchen counter, watching her with dark amusement. "Your brother owed me everything," he murmured. "And now, I own you." Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Brother's Sin. The scent of rosemary and simmering tomatoes, usually a comfort, felt cloying, oppressive. Valeria Marchesi stirred the ragu with a wooden spoon, the rhythmic motion failing to soothe the tremor in her hands. Outside, the Roman twilight painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and fading gold, but inside the small, centuries-old Trastevere apartment, a different kind of darkness was gathering. It had been 3 days since Marco vanished. 3 days since the frantic phone call, his voice a choked whisper of terror and regret. 3 days since Valeria's carefully constructed world, built on quiet routine and the illusion of normalcy, had begun to crumble. She'd always known, deep down, that Marco's recklessness would catch up with him. He was the charming, impetuous younger brother, forever chasing shadows and quick fortunes. Valeria, older by 5 years, had spent her life cleaning up his messes, a role she'd accepted with a weary resignation born of familial duty and a deep, abiding love. But this felt different. The fear that coiled in her stomach was unlike anything she'd ever known. The ragu bubbled, a fat, red drop splattering onto the worn countertop. Valeria barely noticed. Her gaze was fixed on the framed photograph on the windowsill, a faded image of her and Marco as children, their arms slung around each other, their faces bright with carefree laughter. Their parents, long gone, smiled down from a smaller frame beside it, their eyes full of a hope that felt, in this moment, cruelly ironic. A sharp rap at the door echoed through the small apartment, making Valeria jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that it wasn't Marco. He would have used the key, his arrival heralded by a boisterous call of her name and the scent of cheap cologne. This was something else entirely. She wiped her hands on her apron, her movements slow and deliberate, a futile attempt to delay the inevitable. As she reached for the door, a sliver of moonlight illuminated the worn, wooden surface, highlighting the deep scratches near the handle, a silent testament to countless entries and exits, to the lives lived and lost within these walls. With a deep breath, she pulled the door open. He stood there, silhouetted against the dim hallway light, a figure of imposing power and undeniable menace. Niccolò Moretti. The name itself was a whispered curse in certain circles, a legend woven into the very fabric of Rome's underworld. He was taller than she expected, his shoulders broad, his presence filling the doorway, stealing the air from her lungs. His suit, impeccably tailored, was the color of midnight, the fabric hinting at an expensive, understated elegance. But it was his eyes that held her captive. Dark, intense, they seemed to see straight through her, stripping away her carefully constructed facade, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. He didn't smile. His face, sculpted with sharp angles and shadowed hollows, was unreadable, a mask of cold indifference. A faint scar traced a path across his left cheekbone, a silent reminder of the violence that was as much a part of him as the air he breathed. He carried with him the scent of expensive cigars and something else, something darker, something that spoke of power and danger, a primal scent that made the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. "Valeria Marchesi," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a claiming. Valeria swallowed, her throat dry. "Signore Moretti," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, a testament to years of practiced composure. She forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to show the fear that churned within her. He stepped inside, uninvited, his movements fluid and graceful, like a predator entering its domain. Valeria instinctively took a step back, the small kitchen suddenly feeling claustrophobic. He glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on the simmering ragu, the worn furniture, the faded photographs. A flicker of something amusement? Contempt? Crossed his face, but it was gone so quickly, Valeria couldn't be sure. Your brother, he said, turning his attention back to her, his voice devoid of any warmth, is a thief. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Valeria's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She'd known, of course. Marco's desperate phone call had confirmed her worst fears. But to hear it spoken aloud, by this man, in this place, made it all too real. He made a mistake, she stammered, the words feeling weak and inadequate. Niccolò Moretti raised a dark eyebrow, a silent challenge. A mistake? He repeated, the word laced with a subtle mockery. He stole from me, Signora Marchesi. He stole something irreplaceable. Valeria's mind raced. What could Marco have possibly taken that would warrant the attention of Niccolò Moretti? Money? Marco had certainly borrowed, and often failed to repay, significant sums. But Moretti dealt in far greater stakes than Marco's petty gambling debts. I can try to repay you, she offered, the words desperate, knowing the futility of her offer. She had nothing of value, nothing that could possibly compensate for whatever Marco had taken. Moretti let out a short, humorless laugh. Repay me? He leaned closer, his presence overwhelming, his dark eyes boring into hers. Your brother owed me everything. His loyalty, his life, his very soul. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. And now, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, that debt is yours. Valeria felt a chill run down her spine. She understood, with a sickening clarity, what he was implying. This wasn't about money. This was about something far more primal, far more dangerous. This was about ownership. I don't understand, she whispered, though she already did. He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, a touch that was both possessive and threatening. Valeria flinched, but she didn't pull away. She was trapped, caught in a web of her brother's making. And this man, this Niccolò Moretti, was the spider at its center. You will, he said, his voice a low murmur, his eyes dark and unyielding. You will understand everything. Your brother owed me everything. And now I own you. The words echoed in the small kitchen, drowning out the gentle bubbling of the ragu, the distant sounds of the city. Valeria's world, once defined by quiet routine and the comforting aroma of home-cooked meals, had been irrevocably shattered. She was no longer Valeria Marchesi, the quiet, unassuming woman who lived a simple life in Trastevere. She was a debt, a possession, a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a game played by men like Niccolò Moretti. And her life, as she knew it, was over. The fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a flicker of something else began to ignite. Defiance. She wouldn't break. Not entirely. Not yet. She looked up into his dark, fathomless eyes, and a strange calm settled over her. She was going to have to learn to live with her new reality, and perhaps to surprise him. Chapter 2. An offer she cannot refuse. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner, a relic from a time when life felt simpler, less fraught with danger. Valeria stood frozen, Moretti's words echoing in her mind, a chilling pronouncement of ownership that stole the air from her lungs. I own you. He hadn't moved, his hand still hovering near her cheek, the ghost of his touch sending shivers down her spine. It wasn't a caress, not exactly. It was a claiming, a branding, a subtle reminder of the power he held over her. She could smell his cologne now, a blend of sandalwood and something sharper, something that hinted at the danger that clung to him like a second skin. Finally, she found her voice, though it trembled slightly. What do you want from me? Moretti's lips curved into a semblance of a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a predator, cold and calculating. Your brother's debt is substantial, Signora Marchesi. Far more than you could ever hope to repay, with your modest means. He gestured around the small kitchen, his gaze lingering on the chipped paint on the walls, the worn linoleum floor. Valeria bristled at his condescending tone, but she kept her voice even. I will work. I will do whatever it takes to repay you. She was a seamstress, skilled and sought after, though her clientele were mostly local women who appreciated her meticulous work and discreet nature. It wouldn't be enough, not nearly enough, but it was all she had to offer. Moretti chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent another wave of unease through her. Your needle and thread won't settle this debt, Signora. This requires a different kind of service. He stepped back, giving her a sliver of breathing room, though his presence still dominated the small space. He walked over to the window, his back to her, looking out at the darkening cityscape. The lights of Rome twinkled like fallen stars, a beautiful, indifferent backdrop to the unfolding nightmare. There is a situation, he began, his voice measured, within my family. A delicate matter that requires discretion. Someone trustworthy. Someone invisible. Valeria frowned, her mind struggling to grasp his meaning. What could a mafia don possibly need from her, a simple seamstress? He turned back to face her, his eyes holding hers captive. My grandmother, Nana Amelia, is unwell. She is old, frail, and increasingly difficult. She needs a companion, someone to care for her, to attend to her needs. Someone who won't judge her. Valeria's surprise must have shown on her face because Moretti's lips twitched in that almost smile again. You find this amusing, signore? She asked, her voice sharper this time. He shook his head, the movement barely perceptible. Not amusing, signora. Unexpected, perhaps. You see, Nana Amelia is particular. She trusts very few people. And she has a history with your family. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. Her family? What possible connection could her humble family have with the powerful Moretti clan? Her parents had been simple people, her father a bookbinder, her mother a teacher. They had lived quiet, unassuming lives, far removed from the shadowy world of organized crime. I don't understand, she said, the words a whisper. Moretti sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of generations. It's a long story, Signora Marchesi. A story of old loyalties, broken promises, and blood debts. Your grandmother, Isabella, was Nana Amelia's closest confidant, her most trusted friend. They were inseparable, until he trailed off, his gaze darkening. Until what? Valeria pressed, her curiosity overriding her fear. Moretti hesitated, then met her gaze, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of regret and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. Until Isabella betrayed her. Or so Nana Amelia believes. Valeria felt a surge of indignation. Her grandmother, Isabella, had been a kind, gentle woman, incapable of betrayal. That's not true, she said, her voice firm. My grandmother would never. Moretti cut her off with a raised hand. It doesn't matter what you believe, Signora. It matters what Nana Amelia believes. And she believes that your family owes her a debt that has never been repaid. Valeria felt a wave of dizziness. This was insane, a twisted echo of the past reaching out to ensnare her in its grip. She was being held responsible for a supposed betrayal that had occurred decades before she was even born. So, Moretti continued, his voice regaining its cold, detached tone. You will come to live at the Palazzo Moretti. You will care for Nana Amelia. You will be her companion, her confidant. You will earn her trust. It wasn't a request. It was a command disguised as an offer. An offer she couldn't refuse. If she refused, the consequences she didn't even want to contemplate them. Marco's fate, whatever it might be, would undoubtedly be sealed. And her own life, she shuddered to think what Moretti would do to her. And if I succeed? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. If I earn your grandmother's trust? Moretti's eyes narrowed, assessing her. Then, he said slowly, perhaps we can consider your brother's debt partially repaid. Partially. The word hung in the air, a stark reminder that this was only the beginning. This was a game, a dangerous, intricate game, and she was a pawn, a piece to be moved at Moretti's whim. But she was also a Marchesi, and Marcheses didn't break easily. They endured. They survived. She lifted her chin. meeting his gaze with a newfound determination. "I accept," she said, her voice steady, masking the turmoil within. Moretti nodded, a slight inclination of his head. "Good. Pack a bag. You leave tonight." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway, looking back at her. "One more thing, Signor Marchesi," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Try to run, try to betray me, and you will learn that the Moretti family always collects its debts. In full." He left, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded, to Valeria's ears, like the closing of a prison cell. She stood there, alone in the small kitchen, the scent of rosemary and tomatoes now completely overshadowed by the lingering scent of sandalwood and danger. She had made a deal with the devil, and her life, as she knew it, was over. But a new one, however perilous, had just begun. She had to find Marco. She had to protect herself. And somehow, she had to survive the Morettis. She felt a surge of something, a mixture of dread and resolve. She had stepped into his shadow now. She would see if she could find her own light within it. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Palazzo Marchesi. The Palazzo Moretti loomed before her, a fortress of ancient stone and shadowed secrets. It was a world away from her humble Trastevere apartment, a stark contrast that mirrored the chasm that had opened up in her life. The taxi driver, visibly unnerved by the imposing edifice and the two stone-faced men flanking the wrought iron gates, deposited her luggage on the cobblestone drive with a hasty farewell and a muttered prayer. Valeria stood for a moment, her small suitcase feeling heavy in her hand, the weight of her uncertain future pressing down on her. The palazzo was a sprawling structure, its facade a tapestry of weathered stone, ornate balconies, and arched windows that seemed to stare down at her with silent judgment. It was a place of power, a place of history, a place where secrets whispered in the shadows and bloodlines ran deeper than the Tiber. One of the guards, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a scar that bisected his eyebrow, approached her. He didn't speak, merely gestured towards the gates with a curt nod. Valeria followed him, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, the sound swallowed up by the vastness of the palazzo grounds. The gates swung open with a groan of ancient metal, revealing a courtyard bathed in the soft glow of strategically placed lights. A fountain, depicting a scene of mythical figures locked in eternal struggle, gurgled in the center, the water cascading over the worn stone. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and something else, something old and indefinable, the scent of generations of Morettis. The guard led her through the courtyard, past manicured gardens and imposing statues, towards a massive wooden door, intricately carved with scenes of battles and triumphs. It was a door that had witnessed centuries of history, a door that guarded the secrets of one of Rome's most powerful families. As they approached the entrance, the door swung open, revealing a woman standing in the threshold. She was tall and slender, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face, though lined with age, was still striking, her features sharp and aristocratic, her eyes the same piercing dark as Niccolò Moretti's. "This is Signora Antonella, the housekeeper," the guard grunted, his voice devoid of any warmth. He then turned and retreated, leaving Valeria alone with the woman. Signora Antonella studied her for a moment, her gaze assessing, her expression unreadable. "You are Valeria Marchesi," she said, her voice crisp and precise, with a hint of an accent Valeria couldn't quite place. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Valeria replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The housekeeper nodded, a slight inclination of her head. "Follow me." Valeria followed her inside, stepping into a vast entrance hall that took her breath away. The ceiling soared high above, adorned with frescoes depicting scenes of Roman gods and goddesses, their vibrant colors seemingly untouched by time. Marble floors, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the light from crystal chandeliers that hung like glittering jewels. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of beeswax and old wood. Signora Antonella led her through a maze of corridors, past rooms filled with antique furniture, priceless paintings, and tapestries that depicted scenes of battles and hunts. The palazzo was a museum, a testament to the Moretti family's wealth and power, but it also felt like a prison, a gilded cage that held its inhabitants captive. Valeria's mind raced. How could she possibly navigate this world, so different from her own? How could she earn the trust of a woman who believed her grandmother had betrayed her? How could she survive the scrutiny of Niccolò Moretti, a man who held her life in his hands? They stopped before a heavy wooden door, intricately carved with the Moretti family crest, a snarling lion rampant on a field of gold. Signora Antonella knocked softly, then opened the door, revealing a dimly lit room. "Nonna Emilia," she said, her voice softening slightly. "This is Valeria Marchesi. She is here to assist you." Valeria stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was large and opulent, furnished with heavy, antique furniture. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and something else, something medicinal, the faint odor of illness. In a large, four-poster bed, propped up against a mountain of pillows, lay an old woman. She was frail and thin, her skin almost translucent, her white hair a wispy halo around her head. But her eyes, though sunken, were sharp and alert, the same dark, piercing eyes as her grandson. Nonna Emilia looked at her, her gaze unwavering, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire and the shallow breathing of the old woman. Valeria felt a wave of fear, but also a flicker of compassion. This was the woman she was supposed to care for, the woman whose trust she had to earn. This was the key to her brother's freedom and, perhaps, to her own survival. Finally, Nonna Emilia spoke, her voice raspy and weak, but still carrying a hint of the authority that had undoubtedly defined her life. "So," she said, her gaze fixed on Valeria, "you are Isabella's granddaughter." Valeria swallowed, her throat dry. "Yes, signora," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Nonna Emilia continued to study her, her eyes narrowed, as if searching for some hidden truth. "They say you look like her," she said, her voice tinged with a mixture of bitterness and something else, something that sounded almost like longing. Valeria didn't know what to say. She had never known her grandmother, who had died before she was born. She had only seen photographs, faded images of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Come closer," Nonna Emilia commanded, her voice gaining a bit of strength. Valeria hesitated, then took a step forward, approaching the bed. The old woman reached out a trembling hand, her fingers thin and bony, and touched Valeria's cheek. The touch was surprisingly gentle, sending a shiver down her spine. "You have her eyes," Nonna Emilia whispered, her gaze softening slightly. "But you have something else. Something stronger." Valeria didn't know what to make of the old woman's words. Was it a compliment? A warning? A test? She felt a sudden urge to flee, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the palazzo, to return to her simple life, her quiet routine. But she knew she couldn't. She was trapped, bound by her brother's debt, by the whispers of the past, by the power of the Moretti family. "I will do my best to care for you, signora," Valeria said, her voice finding a bit of strength. It was a promise, a vow, spoken not just to the old woman, but to herself. Nonna Emilia closed her eyes, a faint smile playing on her lips. "We shall see," she whispered. "We shall see." The words hung in the air. It did not sound ominous, rather, a dare, a challenge. Valeria knew this was the real start. It was more than servitude. It was a test of her own will, a test of how far she was willing to go. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a question lingered. Where was Niccolò? Chapter 4. The Weight of Family Secrets. The first few days at the Palazzo Moretti were a blur of unfamiliar routines and unspoken rules. Valeria moved through the sprawling mansion like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by thick carpets, her presence barely acknowledged by the silent, watchful staff. Signora Antonella, the ever-present housekeeper, was her guide and, in a way, her jailer, instructing her on Nana Amelia's strict schedule, her dietary restrictions, her numerous medications. Nana Amelia, despite her frailty, was a demanding patient. She expected Valeria to be at her beck and call, anticipating her every need, catering to her every whim. She spent most of her days confined to her bed, surrounded by her memories, her photographs, her rosaries. She spoke little, often lapsing into long silences, her gaze fixed on some distant point, lost in the labyrinth of her past. Valeria found herself spending hours simply sitting by Nana Amelia's bedside, reading aloud from old books, listening to the old woman's rambling stories, trying to decipher the truth from the fiction, the reality from the senile delusions. She learned about Nana Amelia's childhood, her arranged marriage to Don Alessandro Moretti, the birth of her children, the triumphs and tragedies of a life lived within the confines of the mafia world. She also learned more about the supposed betrayal by her grandmother, Isabella. According to Nana Amelia, Isabella had been her closest friend, her confidant, the sister she had never had. They had shared everything, their hopes, their dreams, their secrets. Until, one day, Isabella had stolen something precious from her, something that could never be replaced. "She took my heart, child," Nana Amelia would whisper, her voice choked with emotion, her eyes filled with a pain that was still raw after all these years. "She took the one thing I loved most in the world." Valeria listened patiently, offering words of comfort, trying to soothe the old woman's anguish. She still didn't believe her grandmother was capable of such treachery, but she knew that arguing with Nana Amelia would be futile. Her mission was to earn the old woman's trust, not to challenge her beliefs. She tried to find out more about the nature of the supposed betrayal, but Nana Amelia was vague, her memories clouded by time and resentment. "It was a long time ago," she would say, waving her hand dismissively. "It doesn't matter anymore." But it clearly did matter. The weight of the past hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the debt Valeria owed, the price she had to pay for her brother's sins. She still hadn't seen Niccolò Moretti since the night he had brought her to the palazzo. He was a shadowy presence, a ghost in the machine, his power felt but unseen. She would hear whispers of his comings and goings, of his meetings with other powerful men, of his ruthless dealings in the underworld. She knew he was watching her, assessing her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She tried to find out more about him from Signora Antonella, but the housekeeper was tight-lipped, revealing nothing. "Signore Moretti is a busy man," she would say, her voice devoid of any emotion. "He has many responsibilities." Valeria also tried to find out more about Marco, but her inquiries were met with silence. No one seemed to know anything about his whereabouts, or if they did, they weren't telling her. The uncertainty gnawed at her, fueling her anxiety, making it difficult to sleep, to eat, to focus on anything other than her brother's safety. One evening, while Valeria was preparing Nana Amelia's dinner tray, she overheard a conversation between two maids in the hallway. They were speaking in hushed tones, their voices barely audible, but Valeria's ears, attuned to every nuance of the palazzo's hidden life, caught a few snippets of their exchange. "They say he crossed the Camorra," one maid whispered. "Foolish boy, he should have known better," the other replied. "Moretti will make him pay." Valeria's heart sank. The Camorra. The Neapolitan mafia, even more ruthless and dangerous than the Roman families. If Marco had stolen from them, the consequences would be dire. She waited until the maids had moved on, then quietly approached Signora Antonella, who was overseeing the preparation of the evening meal in the vast, stainless steel kitchen. "Signora Antonella," Valeria began hesitantly, "I overheard something about my brother." "About the Camorra." The housekeeper turned to face her, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't listen to gossip, Signora Marchesi," she said, her voice cold. "But is it true?" Valeria pressed, her voice desperate. "Did Marco steal from them?" Signora Antonella sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. She looked at Valeria, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and warning. "Your brother is a foolish, reckless boy," she said, her voice low. "He has made powerful enemies. And Signore Moretti, He is not a forgiving man. Valeria felt a chill run down her spine. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that Marco was in grave danger. And she, trapped within the walls of the Palazzo Moretti, was powerless to help him. Or was she? An idea, a desperate, dangerous idea, began to form in her mind. She had to find a way to reach out, to find someone who could help her, someone who knew the underworld, someone who could negotiate. She just needed time, and she needed to tread very, very carefully. Tonight, while Nana Emilia slept, she would start searching. The palazzo was full of secrets. She just had to find the right one. The weight of it all felt crushing, but for Marco, she would bear any burden. Chapter 5. A Dance with the Devil Himself. The opportunity presented itself sooner than Valeria expected, and in the most unexpected of ways. 2 evenings later, Nana Emilia, unusually agitated after a restless night, demanded to be taken for a walk in the Palazzo Gardens. It was a rare request, as the old woman seldom left her room, but Signora Antonella, ever attentive to her mistress's whims, agreed. Valeria helped Nana Emilia into a wheelchair, carefully wrapping a shawl around her frail shoulders. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of blooming roses and damp earth. The gardens, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, were a haven of tranquility, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere within the palazzo walls. As they strolled along the winding paths, Nana Emilia, surprisingly talkative, began to reminisce about her late husband, Don Alessandro. He loved these gardens, she said, her voice wistful. He would spend hours here, tending to the roses, planning his business. Valeria listened patiently, pushing the wheelchair slowly, her mind racing. This was her chance. She had to find a way to steer the conversation towards her brother, towards the Camorra, towards someone who might be able to help. Don Alessandro must have been a powerful man, Valeria said carefully, choosing her words with caution. Nana Emilia chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Powerful? She repeated. He was the most powerful man in Rome. Feared and respected by all. Even the Camorra, they trembled before him. Valeria's heart skipped a beat. Here it was. Her opening. The Camorra, she repeated, feigning ignorance. I don't know much about them. Nana Emilia looked at her, her eyes sharp and knowing. They are wolves, child, she said, her voice hardening. Ruthless, bloodthirsty wolves. They control Naples, and they have their claws in Rome, too. They are a force to be reckoned with. And your family, Valeria continued, her voice trembling slightly. They deal with them? Nana Emilia smiled, a cold, knowing smile. We deal with everyone, child, she said. We have to. It's the nature of our business. But we are Morettis. We are not afraid of wolves. We are lions. Valeria took a deep breath, steeling herself. My brother, she began hesitantly. He made a mistake. He crossed the Camorra. Nana Emilia's smile vanished. Her eyes narrowed, her gaze piercing. Your brother is a fool, she said, her voice cold. He should have known better. I know, Valeria said, her voice desperate. But is there anything that can be done? Is there anyone who can help him? Nana Emilia was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Then, she turned to Valeria, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and something else. Something that looked almost like respect. There is one man, she said slowly, her voice barely a whisper. One man who might be able to negotiate with the Camorra. One man who commands their respect, even their fear. Valeria's heart leaped with hope. Who? She asked, her voice trembling. Nana Emilia smiled, a sly, knowing smile. My grandson, she said. Niccolò. Valeria felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Relief, that there was a glimmer of hope. Fear, at the prospect of facing Niccolò Moretti again. And something else. A strange, unsettling flutter in her chest that she couldn't quite explain. But Valeria stammered, he blames me. For my brother's actions. Nana Emilia waved her hand dismissively. Niccolò is a man of passion, she said. He is quick to anger, but he is also just. He will do what is right, even if it is difficult. Valeria didn't know whether to believe her. She had seen the coldness in Nicolo's eyes, the ruthlessness in his demeanor. But she had also seen something else. A flicker of vulnerability, perhaps? A hint of a hidden pain? I need to speak to him, Valeria said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. Nana Emilia nodded.
He will be here tonight, she said.
He always comes to visit me on Thursdays. He will be expecting you. Expecting her? What did that mean? Valeria felt a surge of unease, a premonition of something significant. Later that evening, after Nana Emilia had been settled in bed, Valeria found herself standing outside Niccolò Moretti's study, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was located in a secluded wing of the palazzo, far from the prying eyes of the staff. The door was heavy, imposing, made of dark, polished wood. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the ornate brass doorknob. She was about to enter the lion's den, to face the man who held her fate and her brother's in his hands. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and knocked. A moment later, the door opened, revealing Niccolò Moretti. He was standing in the center of the room, bathed in the soft glow of a desk lamp. He was wearing a dark suit, but he had loosened his tie and unbuttoned the top button of his shirt, revealing a glimpse of tanned skin and a hint of dark chest hair. He looked different. Less formal, less intimidating, but somehow even more dangerous. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. Valeria, he said, his voice a low murmur. I've been expecting you. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Valeria walked inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. The room was large and opulent, furnished with heavy, antique furniture, lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of old books, leather, and Niccolo's cologne, that distinctive blend of sandalwood and something sharper, something that made her pulse quicken. He closed the door behind her, the sound echoing in the silence. He didn't speak, merely stood there, watching her, his eyes intense, his presence overwhelming. Valeria felt a wave of nervousness, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to show her fear. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. About my brother. He raised a dark eyebrow, a silent question. Nana Emilia, she told me that you might be able to help him, Valeria continued, her voice gaining a bit of strength. That you have influence with the Camorra. He walked over to a drinks cabinet, pouring himself a glass of amber liquid. He didn't offer her any. Nana Emilia speaks her mind, he said, his voice dry. Sometimes too freely. He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. Your brother is a liability, Valeria, he said, his voice cold. He has made powerful enemies. He has jeopardized my family. I know, Valeria said, her voice pleading. But he's my brother. I will do anything to help him. He looked at her, his eyes narrowed, assessing her. Anything? He repeated, the word laced with a subtle challenge. Valeria felt a blush creep up her cheeks. She knew what he was implying. She was his, a possession, a debt to be paid. But she also knew that she had something he wanted, something he needed. Her connection to Nana Emilia, her ability to earn the old woman's trust. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a newfound determination. Anything, she said, her voice firm. He smiled then, a slow, predatory smile that sent shivers down her spine. It was a dance, a dangerous, intoxicating dance, and she was stepping onto the floor, willingly, knowing the risks, but determined to win. The stakes were too high to lose. He put down his glass, the crystal ringing softly against the wood, a prelude to the music only they could hear. He stepped toward her, and she, against all reason, felt a tremor that was not entirely fear. Chapter 6. The cold embrace of the Moretti family. He closed the distance between them with a measured grace, his movements fluid and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Valeria stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The scent of him, sandalwood and that underlying, primal note, filled her senses, making her head spin. Anything is a dangerous promise, Valeria, he murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air. He stopped inches from her, his presence overwhelming, his dark eyes boring into hers. She swallowed, her throat dry, but forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm aware of the implications, Signore Moretti," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. His lips curved into that almost smile, the one that didn't reach his eyes. "Niccolò," he corrected her, his voice a silken whisper. "We are family now, after all." Of a sort. The word family felt alien, twisted, coming from him. It was a mockery of the warmth and love she associated with the word, a reminder of the forced intimacy of their situation, the blood debt that bound them together. "Niccolò," she repeated, the name feeling strange on her tongue, foreign and intimate at the same time. "My brother, he needs your help." "I need your help." He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, a touch that was both possessive and something else. Something that sent a jolt of electricity through her, a feeling she couldn't quite define, a mixture of fear and something akin to desire. It was a dangerous feeling, a forbidden feeling, and she fought to suppress it. "And what makes you think I would help him?" he asked, his voice a low murmur, his eyes searching hers. "He has disrespected me, betrayed my family. He deserves to suffer the consequences." Valeria flinched at his words, but she didn't back down. "He made a mistake," she said, her voice pleading. "He's young, reckless. He didn't understand the implications of his actions." Niccolò's hand moved from her cheek to her hair, his fingers tracing the curve of her ear, sending shivers down her spine. "Ignorance is no excuse, Valeria," he said softly. "In our world, mistakes have consequences. Deadly consequences." "But Nana Amelia," Valeria said, grasping at the only leverage she had, she believes in second chances.
She cares about me."
She might be persuaded to intervene on his behalf. Niccolò's eyes narrowed, assessing her. He knew she was playing a game, using his grandmother's affection for her as a bargaining chip. But he also knew that Nana Amelia's influence was considerable, even within the ruthless world of the mafia. He stepped back, breaking the spell, the physical connection that had held her captive. He walked over to the fireplace, staring into the flames, his back to her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire. "Nana Amelia is fond of you," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "She sees something of Isabella in you. Something she has missed." Valeria didn't know what to say. She was still struggling to reconcile the image of her gentle, kind grandmother with the woman Nana Amelia described, the woman who had supposedly betrayed her. "I don't believe my grandmother was capable of betrayal," Valeria said, her voice firm, breaking the silence. Niccolò turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "It doesn't matter what you believe, Valeria," he said, repeating his earlier words. "It matters what Nana Amelia believes. And she believes that your family owes her a debt that you are now paying." Valeria felt a surge of anger, a rebellion against the unfairness of it all. But she knew she had to control her emotions, to play the game, to win his cooperation. "And what about you, Niccolò?" she asked, her voice challenging. "Do you believe in second chances?" He looked at her, his eyes dark and enigmatic. "I believe in justice," he said slowly. "I believe in loyalty. I believe in family." The word family again, this time with a different inflection, a hint of something deeper, something more complex. Valeria wondered about his family, his past, the forces that had shaped him into the man he was, the man who held her life in his hands. "And what about Mercy?" Valeria asked, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled then, a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes, transforming his face, making him look almost human. "Mercy," he repeated, the word laced with a hint of irony, "is a luxury we cannot always afford, Valeria. But sometimes it is the most powerful weapon of all." He walked back towards her, his gaze intense, his presence overwhelming. "I will consider your request," he said, his voice low. "I will speak to the Camorra. But I expect something in return." Valeria's heart skipped a beat. She knew what he was going to say. She was his, a possession, a debt to be paid. But she was also something more. She was a player in this game, and she was determined to play it to her advantage. What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out, his hand cupping her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I want your loyalty," he said, his voice a silken whisper. "I want your obedience. I want your trust." He leaned closer, his lips inches from hers. And he added, his voice dropping to a barely audible murmur, "I want you." Valeria's breath caught in her throat. She was trapped, caught in a web of desire and danger, of fear and fascination. She was dancing with the devil, and she knew that one wrong step could lead to her destruction. But she also knew that she had no choice. She had to play the game, to win his trust, to save her brother, and perhaps to save herself. The cold embrace of the Moretti family was tightening around her, but within that chilling grip, she felt a spark, a flicker of defiance, and, against all reason, a dangerous, undeniable attraction to the man who held her captive. She looked into his eyes, the dark depths mirroring her own uncertain future, and she knew this was only the beginning of their dance. And a small voice, deep in her heart, whispered, "Don't fall." Chapter 7. Echoes of a Forgotten Past. The following days were a tense, unsettling dance of anticipation and veiled threats. Nico Lowe remained an enigma, his moods shifting like the Roman weather, one moment distant and aloof, the next intensely focused on her, his gaze lingering, his presence a constant, palpable pressure. He had made no further overtures, no repeat of that near kiss in his study, but the memory of it hung between them, a charged current that crackled in the air whenever they were in the same room. Valeria continued her duties with Nana Amelia, tending to the old woman's needs, listening to her rambling stories, trying to glean any information that might shed light on the past, on the supposed betrayal by her grandmother. She was walking a tightrope, balancing her feigned concern for Nana Amelia with her desperate search for a way to help Marco, all while navigating the treacherous currents of her growing and increasingly dangerous attraction to Nicolo. One afternoon, while Valeria was helping Nana Amelia sort through a box of old photographs, the old woman pulled out a faded, sepia-toned image of two young women, their arms slung around each other, their faces radiant with laughter. "This was us," Nana Amelia said, her voice wistful, her fingers tracing the outline of the photograph. "Isabella and I. We were inseparable, like sisters." Valeria looked at the photograph, her heart aching. The woman on the left, with the dark, curly hair and mischievous eyes, was undoubtedly Nana Amelia. The woman on the right, with the gentle smile and kind eyes, it was her grandmother, Isabella. She looked exactly as Valeria remembered her from the few photographs she had seen, the photographs she had kept hidden in a drawer in her Trastevere apartment. You were very close," Valeria said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. Nana Amelia nodded, her gaze fixed on the photograph. "We shared everything," she said. "Our hopes, our dreams, our secrets. We were soulmates. And what happened?" Valeria asked hesitantly, her heart pounding in her chest. What did she do?" Nana Amelia's expression hardened, her eyes clouding over with a mixture of bitterness and pain. "She betrayed me," she said, her voice cold. "She stole the one thing I loved most in the world. My Antonio." Valeria's breath caught in her throat. Antonio? A man? The supposed betrayal wasn't about money, or power, or some ancient family feud. It was about love. A love triangle, a story as old as time itself. Antonio he was? Valeria prompted, her voice barely a whisper. "He was my betrothed," Nana Amelia said, her voice choked with emotion. "We were to be married. But he fell in love with Isabella. And she encouraged him. She stole him from me." Valeria felt a wave of sympathy for the old woman, understanding, for the first time, the depth of her pain, the source of her enduring bitterness. But she still couldn't quite believe that her grandmother, the gentle, kind woman she had always admired, was capable of such deliberate cruelty. But did he love her? Valeria asked, her voice trembling. Did Antonio love Isabella? Nana Emilia closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. He did, she whispered. He loved her more than life itself. And she loved him too. Valeria felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Sadness for Nana Emilia, a woman whose heart had been broken by the man she loved. Confusion about her grandmother's role in this tragic love story. And a strange, unsettling sense of understanding. Love could make people do desperate things, irrational things, things that defied logic and reason. And what happened to them? Valeria asked, her voice barely audible. Nana Emilia opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on some distant point, lost in the labyrinth of her memories.
They ran away, she said.
They left Rome, left everything behind, to be together. They broke my heart. And they broke the family's honor. Valeria understood now. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a betrayal of family, of tradition, of the rigid code that governed their lives. It was a scandal, a shame that had cast a long shadow over the Moretti family, a shadow that still lingered, decades later. And Niccolo? Valeria asked, her voice hesitant. Does he know the whole story?
Nana Emilia smiled. A sad, knowing smile.
Niccolo knows what he needs to know, she said. He knows that your family owes us a debt. A debt that has never been repaid. Valeria felt a chill run down her spine. The past was a living thing, a force that shaped the present, a burden that she was now forced to carry. She was trapped in a cycle of betrayal and revenge, a cycle that had begun long before she was born. But it wasn't my fault, Valeria said, her voice pleading. I wasn't even born. Nana Emilia looked at her, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and something else. Something that looked almost like hope. No, child, she said softly. It wasn't your fault. But you're Isabella's granddaughter. And you have a chance to redeem your family's honor. To heal the wounds of the past. Valeria didn't know what to say. She was being asked to atone for the sins of her grandmother, to somehow make amends for a love affair that had shattered two families, a love affair that had echoes even now, in the dangerous attraction she felt for Niccolo Moretti, the grandson of the woman her grandmother had supposedly betrayed. The irony was almost unbearable. She felt the weight of generations pressing down on her, the echoes of a forgotten past shaping her present, dictating her future. But in the midst of the turmoil, a question began to form. Could she rewrite the ending? Could she find a way to break the cycle, to forge a new path for herself, for Marco, and perhaps even for Niccolo? The weight was immense, but the glimmer of possibility was there, a fragile spark in the darkness. Chapter 8. Beneath the Surface of Stone. The revelation about Isabella and Antonio, and the true nature of Nana Emilia's long-held grudge, changed everything. Valeria found herself looking at the old woman with new eyes, seeing not just a frail, bitter matriarch, but a woman whose heart had been broken, whose life had been irrevocably altered by a love affair that had defied the rigid codes of her world. It also changed the way she saw Niccolo. He was no longer just a cold, ruthless mafia don, but a man carrying the weight of his family's history, the burden of a past that wasn't his own, but that shaped his every action. She began to understand, or at least to glimpse, the forces that had molded him, the pressures he faced, the expectations he had to live up to. She found herself seeking him out, drawn to him by a force she couldn't quite explain, a mixture of fear, fascination, and a growing, undeniable attraction. She would find excuses to be in the same room as him, observing him from a distance, watching the way he interacted with his staff, with his family, with Nana Emilia. She noticed the small gestures, the subtle nuances that betrayed the man beneath the surface of stone. The way he softened when he spoke to his grandmother, the hint of respect in his voice, the gentle touch as he adjusted her shawl. The way he commanded authority without raising his voice, the unwavering loyalty he inspired in his men. The way his eyes, those dark, enigmatic eyes, seemed to see straight through her, stripping away her defenses, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. One evening, she found him in the library, standing by the window, looking out at the darkening cityscape. He was dressed casually, in a dark sweater and jeans, his hair slightly disheveled, making him look younger, less intimidating, but somehow even more alluring. He turned as she entered, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of something surprise? Recognition? Crossing his face. "Valeria," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I didn't hear you come in." "I was looking for a book," she said, her voice slightly breathless, gesturing vaguely towards the shelves that lined the walls. It was a lie, of course. She had come looking for him. He raised a dark eyebrow, a silent question. "Nana Amelia, she wanted me to read to her," Valeria continued, her voice gaining a bit of strength. She enjoys the classics." He nodded, his lips curving into that almost smile. "Nana Amelia has refined tastes," he said, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. He walked over to one of the shelves, his movements fluid and graceful, pulling out a leather-bound volume. "This one is her favorite," he said, handing it to her. "Dante's Inferno." Valeria took the book, her fingers brushing against his, sending a jolt of electricity through her. The title, Inferno, felt strangely appropriate, a reflection of the hellish situation she found herself in, the dangerous game she was playing. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes intense, his gaze lingering on her face. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice low. "Thinking about your brother?" Valeria nodded, her heart aching. She hadn't heard anything from Nicolo about his negotiations with the Camorra, and the uncertainty was gnawing at her. "He's working on it," Nicolo said, as if reading her mind. "These things take time." Valeria looked at him, her eyes pleading. "Is he safe?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nicolo hesitated, then met her gaze, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of what was it? Compassion? Regret? "I don't know," he said honestly. "I can't guarantee his safety, but I'm doing everything I can." Valeria felt a surge of gratitude, a flicker of hope in the darkness. He wasn't lying to her, wasn't offering false reassurances. He was being honest, and that, she realized, was worth more than anything. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere, for trying." He nodded, a slight inclination of his head. He looked at her for a moment, his gaze intense, his expression unreadable. Then, he turned away, walking back to the window, staring out at the city lights. Valeria hesitated, then took a step closer to him. "Nicolo," she said softly, I learned about Isabella and Antonio." He didn't turn his back to her, his shoulders tense. "Nana Amelia has been sharing her memories," he said, his voice flat. She loved him very much," Valeria said, her voice barely a whisper. "Antonio." She never got over him. Nicolo turned to face her, his eyes dark and troubled. "It was a different time," he said. "Loyalty to family, it meant everything. Their love, it was a betrayal. Asin." "But it was love," Valeria said, her voice challenging. "Can love ever be a sin?" He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "In our world," he said slowly, "love can be a weakness, a vulnerability, a weapon to be used against you." Valeria understood. She was beginning to understand the rules of this world, the sacrifices that had to be made, the price of loyalty, the dangers of love. And she was beginning to understand Nicolo, the man beneath the surface of stone, the man who carried the weight of his family's history, the man who was both her captor and her protector. "And what about you, Nicolo?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Do you believe in love?" He smiled then, a sad, knowing smile. "I believe in duty," he said. "I believe in responsibility. I believe in protecting my family. At any cost." He stepped closer to her, his presence overwhelming, his gaze intense. "And you, Valeria?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "What do you believe in?" She looked into his eyes, those dark, fathomless depths, and she knew that she was standing on the edge of a precipice, that one wrong step could send her tumbling into the abyss. But she also knew that she couldn't turn back. She was drawn to him, pulled by a force she couldn't resist, a force that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I believe in hope," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I believe in second chances. I believe in the possibility of redemption. And, she added silently, I believe I'm falling in love with you. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, a truth she could no longer deny, a truth that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Beneath the surface of stone, she had found a flicker of something real, something human, and it was changing everything. But where would it lead? Chapter 9. The Price of Loyalty. The unspoken truth hung between them, a fragile, shimmering thing, as delicate and dangerous as a spider's web. Valeria's admission, or rather, her near admission, of her feelings for Nicolo had changed the dynamic between them, adding a new layer of complexity to their already fraught relationship. He hadn't acknowledged it directly, hadn't said the words she longed to hear, but she saw it in his eyes, in the way he looked at her, in the subtle shift in his demeanor. He was more present, more attentive, his gaze lingering on her, his presence a constant, almost palpable force. He sought her out more often, finding excuses to be near her, engaging her in conversations that went beyond the perfunctory, delving into her thoughts, her feelings, her past. He started sharing small fragments of his own life, carefully guarded snippets of information about his childhood, his training, his responsibilities within the family. He spoke of his father, Don Lorenzo, a man he clearly admired and feared in equal measure, a man who had groomed him from a young age to take his place as the head of the Moretti Empire. He was a hard man, Nicolo said one evening, as they sat in the library, the fire crackling in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. But he was just. He taught me everything I know. He taught me the price of loyalty. Valeria looked at him, her eyes searching his. And what is the price of loyalty, Nicolo? She asked softly. He met her gaze, his eyes dark and enigmatic. Everything, he said simply. Your life, your heart, your soul. Valeria shivered, understanding the weight of his words, the burden he carried. He was bound by duty, by tradition, by the expectations of his family, by the code of the Mafia. He had no choice, no freedom, no room for personal desires. And what about love, Nicolo? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Is there room for love in your world? He looked away, his gaze fixed on the flames, his expression unreadable. Love is a weakness, he said, repeating his earlier words. A vulnerability, a distraction from duty. But Valeria saw something else in his eyes, a flicker of longing, a hint of a hidden pain. She knew he was fighting his feelings for her, resisting the pull, the attraction that was growing stronger every day. He was afraid of letting her in, of breaking down the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart. She received news about Marco, finally. Not from Nicolo, but from a surprising source. One of the maids, a young woman named Sophia, who had shown Valeria kindnesses, approached her one morning, her eyes wide with fear. Signora Marchesi, she whispered, her voice trembling, I heard something. About your brother. Valeria's heart leaped with hope and dread. What? She asked, her voice desperate. What did you hear? They say he's alive, Sophia said, her voice barely audible. But he's being held. By the Camorra. They're demanding a ransom. Valeria felt the wave of relief, quickly followed by a surge of panic. A ransom? How could she possibly raise the money? She had nothing of value except herself. She knew what she had to do. She had to offer herself to Nicolo as collateral, as a guarantee that the ransom would be paid. It was a desperate gamble, a dangerous move, but she had no other choice. She found him in his study, late that evening. He was standing by the window, looking out at the city, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He turned as she entered, his eyes questioning. Nicolo, she said, her voice firm, masking the turmoil within. I need to talk to you. About Marco. He raised a dark eyebrow, a silent invitation to continue. I heard he's alive, Valeria said, her voice trembling slightly. But he's being held. By the Camorra. They're demanding a ransom. Nicolo's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise? Anger? Before he quickly masked it. And? he prompted, his voice cold. And I want to offer myself, Valeria said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. As collateral. As a guarantee that the ransom will be paid. He looked at her, his eyes narrowed, assessing her. You would do that? He asked, his voice low. For your brother? Yes, Valeria said, her voice unwavering. I would do anything for him. He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. You are a valuable asset, Valeria, he said slowly. Your connection to Nana Amelia is not easily replaced. Valeria knew what he was saying. He was reminding her of her worth, of her usefulness to him. But he was also acknowledging her sacrifice. I understand, Valeria said, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer to her, his presence overwhelming, his gaze intense. I will pay the ransom, he said, his voice low. But there will be conditions. Valeria's heart skipped a beat.
She knew what he was going to say.
She was his, a possession, a debt to be paid. But she was also something more. She was a woman with agency, with courage, with a fierce love for her brother that would drive her to do anything, even sacrifice herself. The price of loyalty, she was learning, was indeed steep. But she was willing to pay it. She met his eyes, hers filled with a resolve that surprised even her. Name them. Chapter 10. A glimmer of unexpected light. The conditions, when Nicolo finally laid them out, were not what Valeria expected. She had anticipated a demand for her complete submission, a formalization of her status as his possession, a price to be paid in flesh and servitude. Instead, he surprised her. I will pay the ransom, he stated, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. Marco will be returned. But he paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. You will remain here, at the Palazzo Moretti. Not as a prisoner, not as a servant, but as a guest. Valeria frowned, her mind struggling to grasp his meaning. A guest? What did that even mean in this context? I don't understand, she said, her voice hesitant. Nicolo's lips curved into that almost smile, the one that still didn't quite reach his eyes. You will continue to assist Nana Amelia, he explained. But you will also participate in family life. You will attend dinners, social events, meetings as a member of the Moretti household. Valeria's confusion deepened. This wasn't a punishment, it was an elevation. He was offering her a place within his family, a position of what? Respect? Influence? It was baffling and deeply unsettling.
Why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why are you doing this? He looked at her, his eyes dark and enigmatic. You have proven yourself, Valeria, he said slowly. You have shown loyalty, courage, and a surprising understanding of our world. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his gaze intense. And he added, his voice dropping to a low murmur, Nana Amelia has grown fond of you. She trusts you. That is not easily earned. Valeria knew that Nana Amelia's affection was a powerful force, a shield that protected her, a leverage that she could use. But she also knew that Nicolo's motives were more complex than simple deference to his grandmother's wishes. There's something else, she said, her voice challenging. Something you're not telling me. He smiled then, a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes, transforming his face, making him look almost vulnerable. Perhaps, he admitted, his voice soft. Perhaps I am tired of being alone. The admission, so unexpected, so raw, sent a jolt of electricity through her. He was acknowledging the connection between them, the unspoken attraction, the dangerous game they were playing. But your world, Valeria began, her voice hesitant. It's dangerous. It's full of violence, of betrayal. I don't belong here. He reached out, his hand cupping her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. You belong where I choose for you to belong, he said, his voice a silken whisper. And perhaps you are stronger than you think. He leaned closer, his lips inches from hers. And he added, his voice dropping to a barely audible murmur, perhaps I need you. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. The vulnerability in his eyes, the tenderness in his touch, the honesty in his words, it was overwhelming. She was falling, tumbling headfirst into a love that was both forbidden and inevitable. But before she could respond, before she could give voice to the emotions that were swirling within her, a commotion erupted outside the study door. Shouts, followed by the sound of running footsteps, shattered the intimate moment. Nicolo's expression instantly hardened, his eyes narrowing, his body tensing. He moved away from her, his hand reaching inside his jacket, presumably for a weapon. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice sharp, his demeanor once again that of the ruthless mafia don. He opened the door, stepping out into the hallway, his body blocking her view. Valeria heard a flurry of voices, speaking in rapid Italian, too fast for her to understand. She caught snippets of words Camorra, ambush, attack, and her heart sank. The ransom something had gone wrong. Marco, was he safe? After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, Nicolo returned, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "What happened?" Valeria asked, her voice desperate. "Is Marco?" "The exchange was compromised," Nicolo said, his voice tight. "The Camorra, they betrayed us. They tried to kill my men." "And Marco?" Valeria pressed, her voice trembling. "What about Marco?" Nicolo hesitated, then met her gaze, his eyes filled with regret. He escaped," he said slowly. "In the chaos, he got away." Valeria felt a wave of relief, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. Marco was alive. He was free. But he was also alone, hunted by both the Camorra and, potentially, by Nicolo's men. "But he's in danger," Valeria said, her voice barely a whisper. "He needs help." Nicolo looked at her, his expression unreadable. "He made his choice," he said, his voice cold. "He chose to run. He is no longer my concern." Valeria felt a surge of anger, a betrayal of the fragile trust that had been building between them. "He's my brother," she cried, her voice rising. You promised." Nicolo's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing. "I promised to pay the ransom," he said, his voice hard. "I did. He chose to defy me. He is a liability." Valeria knew that he was right, in his own twisted logic. Marco was a loose end, a threat to Nicolo's carefully controlled world. But he was also her brother, and she couldn't abandon him. A glimmer of unexpected light had appeared with Marco's escape, but it was shrouded in a new, even more perilous darkness. She had a choice to make, and she knew, with a sinking heart, what it had to be. She had to protect Marco, even if it meant betraying Nicolo. The glimmer was fading fast, replaced by the cold, hard reality of her situation. Chapter 11. The Unveiling of Hidden Truths. The fragile truce between Valeria and Nicolo shattered with Marco's escape. The simmering tension, the unspoken attraction, the growing trust, all of it evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard distance. Nicolo retreated behind his walls, becoming once again the ruthless, inaccessible mafia don, his eyes devoid of any warmth, his demeanor chilling. Valeria found herself isolated, adrift in a sea of uncertainty and fear. She was still a guest at the Palazzo Moretti, still attending to Nonna Emilia, still participating in family meals, but the pretense of normalcy was a thin veil, barely concealing the underlying animosity. She tried to reach out to Nicolo, to plead with him to help Marco, but her attempts were met with silence, with a cold indifference that was more painful than any outright rejection. He was punishing her, blaming her for her brother's actions, for the disruption of his carefully ordered world. She spent her days in a state of anxious anticipation, waiting for news of Marco, praying for his safety, while simultaneously navigating the treacherous currents of the Moretti household. She knew she was being watched, scrutinized, her every move assessed. She was a liability, a potential threat, and she had to tread carefully. One evening, while Valeria was helping Nonna Emilia sort through a box of old letters, the old woman pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound diary. "This was Isabella's," Nonna Emilia said, her voice wistful, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the cover. She wrote everything in here. Her thoughts, her feelings, her secrets. Valeria's heart skipped a beat. Isabella's diary. This could be the key, The answer to the questions that had been haunting her, the truth about the past, about the supposed betrayal, about the love affair that had shattered two families. Can I read it? Valeria asked hesitantly, her voice trembling. Nana Emilia looked at her, her eyes searching hers. It might be painful, she said softly. It might reveal things you don't want to know. Valeria nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. I need to know the truth, she said, her voice firm. I need to understand. Nana Emilia hesitated, then handed her the diary. Read it, she said, and perhaps you will find what you are looking for. Valeria took the diary, her hands trembling. She opened it carefully, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The ink faded, but still legible. Isabella's handwriting was delicate and elegant, a stark contrast to the turbulent emotions that poured forth from the pages. She started reading, slowly, painstakingly, deciphering the words, piecing together the story of a young woman caught between love and duty, between passion and family, between her heart and her conscience. Isabella's words painted a vivid picture of her life, her friendship with Nana Emilia, her arranged engagement to Don Alessandro, her growing and increasingly forbidden love for Antonio. She wrote of her struggles, her guilt, her despair, her desperate attempts to reconcile her feelings with her obligations. Valeria read about the secret meetings, the stolen kisses, the desperate plans to run away, to escape the suffocating constraints of their world. She read about Isabella's fear of Nana Emilia's reaction, her fear of bringing shame upon her family, her fear of the consequences of her actions. And then she found it, the entry that changed everything, the entry that revealed the truth, the whole truth, about the supposed betrayal. I cannot do it, Isabella wrote, her handwriting trembling, her words blurred with tears. I cannot betray Emilia. I cannot break her heart. I love Antonio, more than life itself, but I cannot destroy her. I have made a decision. A terrible, agonizing decision. I will sacrifice my own happiness for her sake. I will tell him it is over. Valeria's breath caught in her throat. Isabella hadn't betrayed Nana Emilia. She had sacrificed her own happiness, her own love, to protect her friend. She had chosen duty over desire, family over passion, a choice that had condemned her to a life of quiet despair, a life without the man she loved. Antonio, it was unveiled, was not Emilia's betrothed. It was arranged, but Antonio had always loved Isabella. Emilia, consumed by her own desires, had manipulated the situation, fully aware of Antonio's true affections. It was Emilia who betrayed Isabella, twisting the narrative to secure her own position. Valeria felt a surge of anger, a righteous indignation on behalf of her grandmother, a woman who had been wrongly accused, wrongly condemned, for decades. She also felt a profound sadness, a sense of the tragic waste of two lives, a love story that had ended in heartbreak and regret. She closed the diary, her hands trembling, her mind racing. She had to tell Niccolò. She had to reveal the truth, to clear her grandmother's name, to expose Nana Emilia's lies. But how? He wouldn't believe her. He was blinded by his loyalty to his grandmother, by the weight of family history, by the code of the mafia. She needed proof, something more than just Isabella's words, something that would convince Niccolò, something that would force him to see the truth. And she knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, where to find it. The hidden truths were coming to light, but the revelation threatened to shatter everything, not just the past, but the fragile present she had carefully constructed. The unveiling was necessary, but the consequences, they were terrifying. Chapter 12. A web of deceit and desire. The proof, Valeria realized, lay in the letters. The box that Nana Emilia had been sorting through, the box that contained Isabella's diary, also contained a collection of old letters tied together with faded ribbons, their envelopes yellowed and brittle with age. Letters from Antonio to Isabella, letters that Nana Emilia had likely intercepted, letters that would reveal the truth about their love, about their plans, about Isabella's sacrifice. She waited until Nana Emilia was asleep, then crept back into the old woman's room, her heart pounding in her chest. She found the box, carefully hidden beneath a pile of blankets in a large, antique chest. She opened it, her hands trembling, her breath catching in her throat. The letters were there, dozens of them. Their ink faded but still legible, their words filled with a passion, a longing, a desperation that transcended time. Antonio's handwriting was bold and impetuous, a stark contrast to Isabella's delicate script. She started reading, skimming through the letters, searching for the crucial piece of evidence that would prove Isabella's innocence, that would expose Nana Emilia's lies. And then she found it. A letter, dated just days before Isabella and Antonio were supposed to run away, a letter in which Antonio wrote of his love for Isabella, of his joy at their impending escape, of his gratitude for her courage, for her willingness to defy her family, to risk everything for their love. "My dearest Isabella," he wrote, "I count the hours until we are together, until we can finally be free from the shackles of duty and tradition, free to love each other without fear, without shame. You are my life, my heart, my soul. I will love you forever." But the most crucial part was a postscript, added almost as an afterthought, a detail that changed everything. "P.S. I have secured passage on a ship leaving for America next week. I have also spoken to your cousin Marco, who has agreed to help us. He will provide us with false documents and a safe place to stay until we can board the ship." Valeria's breath caught in her throat.
Marco.
Her grandmother's cousin Marco. The same name as her brother. It couldn't be a coincidence. The past was repeating itself, a twisted echo of history, a cycle of betrayal and revenge that had ensnared her family, generation after generation. The same family connection that Nana Emilia had twisted and used to bind Valeria to this debt was the key to unlocking the entire lie. She carefully put the letter back in the box, her mind racing. She had the proof, the undeniable evidence of Isabella's innocence, of Nana Emilia's deceit. But how to use it? How to confront Niccolò, a man blinded by loyalty and tradition, a man who had built his entire life on a lie? She decided to take a risk, a desperate gamble. She would confront Nana Emilia first, force her to confess the truth, to admit her manipulation, her lies. And then, she would present the evidence to Niccolò, hoping, praying, that he would believe her, that he would see the truth for what it was. The next morning, after Nana Emilia had taken her medication, after she was settled in her bed, Valeria approached her, the letter clutched in her hand. "Signora," Valeria said, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to talk to you. About Isabella. About Antonio." Nana Emilia looked at her, her eyes narrowed, her expression wary. "What about them?" she asked, her voice raspy. I read Isabella's diary," Valeria said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "And I found this." She held out the letter, Antonio's letter, the proof of Isabella's innocence. Nana Emilia's eyes widened, her face paling, her hand reaching out to take the letter, her fingers trembling. She read it, slowly, painstakingly, her expression changing from disbelief to shock to horror. She looked up at Valeria, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was in the box," Valeria said, her voice firm. "With the other letters. Letters from Antonio to Isabella. Letters that you never gave her." Nana Emilia closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "I did what I had to do," she whispered. "To protect my family. To protect my honor." "But it was a lie," Valeria said, her voice rising. "Isabella, she didn't betray you. She sacrificed her own happiness for you. She loved Antonio. But she chose you. She chose family." Nana Emilia opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on Valeria, her expression broken. "I know," she whispered. I always knew. Deep down I knew." The confession, so long overdue, so painful, hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Nana Emilia had lived with this lie for decades, had built her entire identity on a false narrative, had manipulated her family, had condemned an innocent woman.
Why?
Valeria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why did you do it? Nana Emilia looked at her, her eyes filled with a profound sadness, a regret that was almost unbearable. I was jealous, she whispered. I was afraid. I wanted Antonio for myself. I couldn't bear the thought of losing him.
So elite. I manipulated.
I destroyed everything. The truth, finally revealed, was a devastating blow, a confirmation of Valeria's suspicions, a vindication of her grandmother's innocence. But it was also a relief. The burden of the past, the weight of the lie, had been lifted. The web of deceit was unraveling, but the threads of desire, the complex feelings she had for Niccolò, remained, tangled and strong. Now, she had to face him, armed with the truth, and hope that he would choose love over loyalty, truth over tradition. It was a slim hope, a dangerous gamble, but she had to try. The unveiling was complete now, the reckoning. She just didn't know what that would look like, or if their fragile bond could survive it. Chapter 13. The cracks in the foundation. Armed with the truth, with Antonio's letter and Nana Emilia's confession, Valeria sought out Niccolò. She found him in his study, as she had so many times before, standing by the window, looking out at the city, his silhouette framed against the twilight sky. He turned as she entered, his eyes questioning, his expression wary. He knew something was different. He could sense the shift in her demeanor, the newfound resolve in her eyes. Niccolò, she said, her voice firm, masking the tremor in her hands. We need to talk. About everything. He raised a dark eyebrow, a silent invitation to continue. He didn't speak, merely stood there, watching her, his gaze intense, his presence overwhelming. Valeria took a deep breath, steeling herself. She walked towards him, stopping just a few feet away, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to smell his cologne, that familiar blend of sandalwood and something sharper, something that always made her pulse quicken. I know the truth, she said, her voice unwavering. About Isabella and Antonio. About Nana Emilia. His expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise? Apprehension? Before he quickly masked it. What truth? He asked, his voice cold, guarded. Valeria held out the letter, Antonio's letter, the proof of Isabella's innocence, the evidence of Nana Emilia's deceit. Read this, she said. It's a letter from Antonio to Isabella, written just days before they were supposed to run away. He took the letter, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the faded ink, his expression hardening with each word he read. He finished reading, his face a mask of disbelief, of anger, of betrayal. He looked up at Valeria, his eyes dark and turbulent. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice tight, controlled. From Nana Emilia, Valeria said. She kept it hidden all these years. And she admitted it? Niccolò asked, his voice barely a whisper. She confessed? Valeria nodded. She did, she said. She told me everything. She lied, Niccolò. She manipulated the situation. She knew Antonio loved Isabella. She destroyed their lives. And she used that lie to control you. To control your family. Niccolò turned away, walking over to the fireplace, staring into the flames, his back to her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire. It can't be true, he said finally, his voice hoarse, his shoulders slumping. She wouldn't, she did. Niccolò, Valeria said softly, stepping closer to him. She admitted it. She was jealous, afraid. She made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But it's the truth. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a pain, a confusion, a vulnerability that she had never seen before. The foundations of his world, the beliefs he had held sacred, the loyalty he had sworn to uphold, were crumbling around him. My whole life, he whispered, his voice broken. It's been a lie. Valeria reached out, her hand touching his arm, a gesture of comfort, of support. Not your whole life, Niccolò, she said. Just a part of it. The past, it doesn't have to define you. It doesn't have to control you. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeking solace, seeking understanding, seeking something more. And Marco? He asked, his voice hesitant. What about Marco? Valeria explained about the postscript in Antonio's letter, about Isabella's cousin, Marco, who had agreed to help them escape. The connection, the echo of the past, the cyclical nature of their family history. Niccolò listened, his expression unreadable. He was processing, absorbing, trying to reconcile the truth with the lies he had been told, the beliefs he had held for so long. So it's a family pattern? He asked finally, his voice tinged with a hint of irony. A recurring betrayal? Not a betrayal, Niccolò. Valeria corrected him. A sacrifice. Isabella, she sacrificed her own happiness for her family. And Marco, he's trying to escape the same cycle. He's not a thief, Niccolò. He's a victim. Niccolò looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions, anger, confusion, regret, and something else. Something that looked almost like hope. And you? He asked, his voice low, his gaze intense. What do you want, Valeria? She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was the moment, the turning point, the chance to forge a new path, to break free from the past, to embrace the future. I want the truth, she said, her voice firm. I want justice. I want Marco to be safe. And she hesitated, then took a deep breath, steeling herself. I want you. The words hung in the air, heavy and vulnerable, a declaration of love, a confession of desire, a plea for acceptance. The cracks in the foundation of his world were widening, revealing the raw, exposed core of the man beneath the stone. He didn't speak, merely stood there looking at her, his eyes dark and searching. The future was uncertain, the path ahead unclear, but for the first time, it felt like their future, a shared journey, not a predetermined destiny dictated by the past. The question was, would he take her hand and walk it with her? Chapter 14. A taste of forbidden freedom. The silence that followed Valeria's declaration was thick with unspoken emotions, a maelstrom of fear, desire, hope, and uncertainty swirling between them. Niccolò's gaze was intense, unwavering, searching hers as if trying to decipher the truth hidden within her soul. He didn't speak, didn't move, his body taut, his expression unreadable. Valeria's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of anticipation and dread. She had laid bare her soul, confessed her feelings, risked everything. And now, she could only wait for his response, wait for the verdict that would determine their future. Finally, he moved, stepping closer to her, his presence overwhelming, his scent, that familiar blend of sandalwood and danger, filling her senses. He reached out, his hand cupping her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, a gesture that was both tender and possessive. You want me, he repeated, his voice a low, husky murmur, the words not a question, but a statement, an acknowledgement of the undeniable truth that hung between them. Yes, Valeria whispered, her voice trembling slightly, her gaze locked with his. I do. He leaned closer, his lips inches from hers, his breath warm on her skin. Even after everything? He asked, his voice barely audible. Even after the lies, the betrayal, the danger? Because of everything, Valeria replied, her voice firm, her heart swelling with a love that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Because you are more than your family's past. You are more than the mafia. You are you. He closed the distance between them, his lips finally claiming hers, a kiss that was both tentative and demanding, a kiss that spoke of longing, of passion, of a desperate need that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. Valeria responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body molding against his, her heart overflowing with a love that defied logic, that defied reason, that defied the dangerous world they inhabited. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate, a release of pent-up emotions, a breaking down of walls, a merging of two souls who had found each other in the midst of chaos and darkness. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, their hearts pounding in unison. Nicolo's gaze was filled with a tenderness, a vulnerability that she had only glimpsed before, a stark contrast to the cold, ruthless mask he usually wore. "Valeria," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, his hand still cupping her face. He hesitated, struggling to find the words, struggling to reconcile his feelings with the ingrained beliefs, the rigid code that had governed his life. "I care for you," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "More than I should. More than is safe." It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the traditional sense, but it was enough. It was an admission, an acknowledgement of the connection between them, a promise of something more. He agreed to help Marco. Not out of obligation, not out of duty, but because she asked him to. Because he cared for her. He promised to use his influence, his connections, to ensure Marco's safety, to help him disappear, to give him a new life, far away from the reach of the Camorra, far away from the shadows of the Moretti family. For the first time since Marco's disappearance, since her forced entry into Nicolo's world, Valeria felt a sense of hope. A glimmer of light in the darkness, a taste of forbidden freedom. They spent the next few days in a state of suspended reality, a bubble of intimacy and tenderness, shielded from the harsh realities of their world. They talked, they shared, they explored each other's hearts and minds, forging a connection that was deeper, stronger, than anything either of them had ever experienced. Nicolo revealed more of himself, sharing stories of his childhood, his training, his struggles to live up to his father's expectations, his growing disillusionment with the violence and brutality of the mafia life. Valeria, in turn, shared her dreams, her fears, her hopes for the future, a future that, for the first time, seemed to include him. They took walks in the Palazzo gardens, hand in hand, stealing kisses under the watchful eyes of the ancient statues, whispering secrets in the shadows. They shared meals, intimate dinners in Nicolo's study, the fire crackling in the hearth, casting a warm glow on their faces. It was a fragile idyll, a temporary escape from the dangers that lurked just outside the Palazzo walls, a taste of a life they could never fully have, a life of normalcy, of love, of freedom. But it was real, it was precious, and they clung to it with a desperate intensity, knowing that it couldn't last, that the real world would inevitably intrude. The taste of forbidden freedom was sweet, intoxicating, but it was also fleeting, a reminder of the constraints that still bound them, a prelude to the storm that was sure to come. But for now, in this stolen moment, they were simply Nicolo and Valeria, two souls connected by a love that defied all odds. The question was, would it be enough? Chapter 15. The Lion's Denver. The fragile peace, the stolen moments of intimacy and tenderness, were shattered, as Valeria knew they would be, by the intrusion of the outside world. A meeting was called, a gathering of the Moretti family's inner circle, the capi, the lieutenants, the men who controlled the various rackets, the territories, the businesses that made up the vast and illegal Moretti empire. Nicolo informed Valeria that she would be attending, not as an observer, not as a servant, but as his companion. A statement, a declaration of his intentions, a signal to his family, to his enemies, that she was under his protection, that she was his. Valeria was apprehensive, terrified, but also strangely excited. This was a test, a challenge, a chance to prove herself, to show them that she was not just a pawn, not just a debt to be paid, but a woman of strength, of intelligence, of worth. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant black dress, a stark contrast to the more ostentatious attire she expected the other women to wear. She wore her hair down, her only jewelry a simple silver necklace, a gift from her mother, a reminder of her past, of her roots, of the woman she once was. Nicolo, when he saw her, simply nodded, his eyes lingering on her face, a flicker of approval, of pride, in his gaze. He offered her his arm, a gesture of protection, of possession, and together, they walked into the lion's den. The meeting was held in a large, opulent room in a secluded wing of the palazzo, a room Valeria had never seen before. The walls were paneled in dark wood, the ceiling adorned with frescoes depicting scenes of Roman battles and triumphs. A long, mahogany table dominated the room, surrounded by high-backed chairs, each occupied by a man of power, a man of violence, a man who lived by a code of loyalty and fear. The air was thick with cigar smoke, with the scent of expensive cologne, with the palpable tension of unspoken rivalries, of hidden agendas, of simmering violence. The men, when Valeria and Niccolò entered, fell silent, their eyes turning to them, assessing, judging, questioning. Niccolò led her to a seat at the table, a seat beside his own, a position of honor, of prominence, a clear statement of her status within the family. He introduced her, simply, as Valeria Marchesi, his voice calm, authoritative, leaving no room for doubt, for challenge. The men, after a moment of stunned silence, nodded their greetings, their expressions carefully masked, their eyes betraying a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and resentment. Valeria could feel their hostility, their disapproval, their unspoken questions about her presence, her role, her influence over Niccolò. The meeting began, a discussion of business, of territories, of rivals, of threats, of opportunities. Valeria listened, intently, trying to decipher the coded language, the veiled references, the unspoken implications. She understood little of the specifics, but she grasped the overall picture, the intricate web of power and violence that defined the Moretti family's world. She noticed the subtle dynamics, the shifting alliances, the undercurrents of tension between the various capi. She saw the fear in their eyes, the respect, the obedience they showed to Niccolò. He was the undisputed leader, the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, his authority absolute, his word law.
But she also saw something else.
She saw the cracks in the foundation, the simmering discontent, the growing resentment towards Niccolò's changes. His decision to help Marco, his relationship with her, his softening, were perceived as weaknesses, as vulnerabilities, as threats to the established order. One man in particular stood out. A man named Salvatore, older than the others, with a scarred face and cold, calculating eyes. He was Niccolò's uncle, his father's brother, a man who had once held a position of power within the family, a man who clearly resented Niccolò's ascension. Salvatore challenged Niccolò, subtly at first, questioning his decisions, questioning his judgment, questioning his commitment to the family's traditions. His words were veiled, respectful on the surface, but his tone was laced with a subtle mockery, a barely concealed contempt. "Niccolò," he said, his voice smooth, his eyes fixed on Valeria, "you have expanded our family. A welcome addition, I'm sure. But one must be careful to not let sentiment cloud one's judgment." The implication was clear. Valeria was a weakness, a liability, a distraction that was clouding Niccolò's judgment, making him vulnerable. Niccolò's response was swift and brutal. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, didn't flinch. He simply looked at Salvatore, his eyes dark and unwavering, his expression cold and implacable. "My judgment, uncle," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "is not clouded. It is clear. Valeria Marchesi is under my protection. She is mine. Any disrespect to her is disrespect to me, and that will not be tolerated." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth. Salvatore's face paled, his eyes dropping, his body tensing. He had challenged Niccolò, and he had lost. The message was clear, unequivocal. Valeria was untouchable. She was Niccolò's. The meeting continued, but the dynamic had shifted. The tension had escalated. The cracks had widened. The battle lines had been drawn. Valeria knew that she was at the center of it all, a catalyst for change, a symbol of Niccolò's defiance of tradition, of his love for her. The lion's den was a dangerous place, a place of power and violence, a place where loyalties were tested, where betrayals were plotted, where lives were expendable. And she, a simple seamstress from Trastevere, was now a player in this deadly game, A game she had never chosen to play, a game she had to win, not just for herself, but for Niccolò, for Marco, for the future. The meeting was a declaration, not just of her status, but of the war to come. And she, unexpectedly, was ready. Chapter 16. Scars of the Heart. The meeting, with its veiled threats and simmering tensions, left Valeria shaken but also strangely empowered. She had seen the raw power of Niccolò, the fear he inspired, the loyalty he commanded. But she had also seen the vulnerability beneath the surface, the cracks in the foundation of his world, the potential for change. She had also, for the first time, felt the weight of her own position, the responsibility that came with being Niccolò's chosen companion, the woman he had placed under his protection, the woman he had, in his own way, declared his love for. In the days that followed, Valeria found herself drawn deeper into Niccolò's world, privy to information, to conversations, to decisions that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. She was no longer just a guest, a companion, a lover. She was becoming a confidant, an advisor, a partner. She learned more about the Moretti family's operations, the intricate web of businesses, both legitimate and illegal, that made up their vast empire. She learned about the rivalries, the alliances, the constant threat of violence that hung over their lives. She also learned more about Niccolò, about his past, about the scars he carried, both visible and invisible. She saw the burden of responsibility he bore, the weight of expectations, the loneliness of his position. One evening, as they sat together in his study, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls, Niccolò showed her a photograph, an old, faded image of a young boy, standing beside a tall, imposing man, his father, Don Lorenzo. He trained me from a young age, Niccolò said, his voice soft, his gaze fixed on the photograph. He taught me everything I know. He taught me the code. Loyalty, duty, family above all else. Valeria looked at the photograph, at the young Niccolò, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and fear. She saw the seeds of the man he had become, the man who had been molded by violence, by tradition, by the expectations of his family. "And what about love, Niccolò?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Did he teach you about love?" Niccolò looked at her, his eyes dark and troubled. "Love," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of bitterness, was a weakness, a vulnerability, something to be avoided, something to be controlled. "But you don't believe that, do you?" Valeria asked, her voice challenging. "Not anymore." He hesitated, then met her gaze, his eyes filled with a tenderness, a vulnerability that she had only glimpsed before. "I don't know what I believe anymore," he said honestly. You've changed everything, Valeria. You've shown me another way, a different possibility." He reached out, his hand tracing the line of her cheek, his touch gentle, hesitant. "But it's dangerous," he said, his voice low. "For you, for me, for us." Valeria knew he was right. Their love was a threat to everything he had ever known, everything he had ever believed in. It was a challenge to the established order, a defiance of tradition, a betrayal of his family's code. "I'm not afraid, Niccolò," she said, her voice firm, her heart swelling with a love that was stronger than fear, stronger than doubt, stronger than anything. He smiled then, a sad, knowing smile. "You should be," he said. "But perhaps that's why I care for you so much. Your courage, your strength, your unwavering belief in me." He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers, a kiss that was both tender and desperate, a promise of a future that was uncertain, a future that was theirs. But the scars of the past, both his and hers, ran deep. The weight of family history, the burden of tradition, the constant threat of violence, hung over them like a dark cloud, threatening to extinguish the fragile flame of their love. Valeria knew that the challenges were just beginning. Salvatore, and others like him, would not accept her, would not accept Niccolò's defiance of the code. They would fight back, they would plot, they would betray. She also knew that Marco was still out there, alone, hunted, in danger. She had to find him, to help him, to keep the promise she had made to Niccolò, to herself. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that Nana Amelia, despite her confession, despite her apparent remorse, was still a force to be reckoned with. The old woman had lived a life of manipulation, of deceit, of power. She would not relinquish her control easily. The scars of the heart were the deepest, the most painful, the most difficult to heal. Valeria and Nicolo had found each other, had found love in the midst of darkness, but their journey was far from over. The battle for their future, for their love, for their lives, had just begun. And the wounds of the past, the betrayals, the lies, the secrets, threatened to tear them apart. The question was, could their love withstand the storm? Could they heal the scars? Or would they be consumed by them? Chapter 17. The storm breaks. The storm, when it finally broke, came not from Salvatore, as Valeria had expected, but from a source far more insidious, far more personal. Nana Amelia. The old woman, despite her confession, despite her apparent remorse, had not relinquished her grip on power, on control. She had merely shifted her tactics, adopting a new strategy, a more subtle, more manipulative approach. She had seemed to accept Valeria, to welcome her into the family, to even approve of her relationship with Nicolo. She had been kind, attentive, almost motherly. But it was all a facade, a carefully constructed performance, designed to lull Valeria into a false sense of security, to lower her guard, to exploit her vulnerabilities. Valeria, blinded by her love for Nicolo, by her desire to believe in the possibility of redemption, of change, had fallen for it. She had trusted Nana Amelia, had confided in her, had underestimated her. The truth came out, as it always does, in a way that was both shocking and inevitable. A phone call, a whispered conversation, a overheard snippet of dialogue, revealed Nana Amelia's true intentions. She was plotting, not against Valeria directly, but against Nicolo. She was using Valeria as a weapon, a tool to weaken him, to undermine his authority, to reclaim her control over the family. She had been secretly communicating with Salvatore, encouraging his dissent, fueling his resentment, orchestrating a plan to remove Nicolo from power. And she had been using Valeria's relationship with Nicolo, her influence over him, as leverage, as a way to manipulate him, to control him. Valeria discovered this by accident, overhearing a conversation between Nana Amelia and one of her longtime and fiercely loyal servants. They were speaking in hushed tones, in the old woman's room, but Valeria, passing by in a hallway, caught a few snippets of their exchange. "She is the key," Nana Amelia whispered, her voice raspy but firm. "She is his weakness. We can use her to control him, and if she refuses?" The servant asked, his voice hesitant. "She won't," Nana Amelia replied, her voice laced with a chilling certainty. "She loves him. She will do anything for him, even betray him." Valeria's blood ran cold. She felt a wave of nausea, of dizziness, of betrayal. Nana Amelia, the woman she had trusted, the woman she had believed in, had been playing her all along. She was not a friend, not an ally, not a reformed sinner. She was a predator, a manipulator, a monster. Valeria, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest, knew she had to act quickly. She had to warn Nicolo, to expose Nana Amelia's treachery, to save him. She found him in his study, working late, as usual, poring over documents, his face etched with worry, with the weight of responsibility he carried. He looked up as she entered, his eyes questioning, his expression softening slightly when he saw her. "Valeria," he said, his voice a low murmur. "What is it? You look pale." She didn't hesitate, didn't mince words. She told him everything, everything she had overheard, everything she had realized, everything she feared. Nicolo listened, his expression hardening with each word she spoke, his eyes darkening with anger, with disbelief, with betrayal. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, didn't doubt her. He simply listened. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his mind processing, absorbing, the enormity of the revelation. She wouldn't, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper, his words a denial, a plea, a desperate attempt to cling to the last vestiges of his belief in his grandmother. She did, Nicolo, Valeria said softly, her voice filled with compassion, with understanding. She is not who you think she is. She is dangerous. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain, a confusion, a vulnerability that tore at her heart. He was a strong man, a powerful man, a man accustomed to control, to command, but in this moment, he was lost, adrift, betrayed by the one person he had always trusted, the one person he had always loved. What do we do? He asked after another long moment of thought. We fight back, Nicolo, Valeria said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. We expose her. We protect ourselves. We protect our future. He nodded, a slight inclination of his head, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of gratitude, of love, in their depths. He reached out, his hand taking hers, his grip strong, reassuring. The storm had broken, and it was raging around them. Nana Amelia's betrayal was a devastating blow, a wound that cut deep, a threat that loomed large. But they were not alone. They had each other, and they would face it together. The battle lines had been drawn, not just between Nicolo and his family, but between truth and lies, between love and betrayal, between the past and the future. And Valeria, once a pawn in this deadly game, was now a warrior, ready to fight for the man she loved, for the life they had dreamed of, for everything. The storm was fierce, but their love, their resolve, was stronger. Or so she hoped. Chapter 18. Reckoning and Redemption. The confrontation with Nana Amelia was inevitable, and it was brutal. Nicolo, armed with Valeria's information, with the undeniable truth of his grandmother's betrayal, confronted her in her room, the very place where she had spun her web of deceit, the very place where she had plotted against him. Valeria was with him, standing by his side, a silent witness, a source of strength, a symbol of his defiance, of his love for her. Nana Amelia, when confronted, didn't deny it. She didn't plead, didn't apologize, didn't beg for forgiveness. She simply admitted it. Yes, she said, her voice cold, her eyes defiant, her frail body trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. I did it. I had to.
For the family.
For tradition.
For what is right.
Nicolo's face was a mask of fury, of betrayal, of heartbreak. He had loved his grandmother, had trusted her, had revered her, and she had betrayed him, used him, manipulated him, for her own selfish purposes. You lied, he said, his voice low and dangerous, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You used Valeria. You plotted against me. You were weak. Nana Amelia spat back, her voice filled with contempt. You were blinded by her. By love. You were forgetting your duty. Your responsibility. Your family. My family? Nicolo roared, his voice echoing through the room. You are not my family. You are a poison. A cancer. You have corrupted everything. Valeria reached out, her hand touching Nicolo's arm, a gesture of calm, of restraint, of love. She knew he was on the edge, on the verge of losing control, of succumbing to the rage, the violence that was so deeply ingrained in him. Nicolo, she said softly, her voice firm, her eyes meeting his. Don't let her win. Don't become like her. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeking solace, seeking strength, seeking guidance. He took a deep breath, his body relaxing slightly, his rage subsiding, replaced by a cold, hard determination. You are banished, he said to Nana Amelia, his voice devoid of any emotion, his gaze unwavering. From this house. From this family. From my life. You will leave.
Now.
Nana Amelia's face paled, her eyes widening in disbelief, in fear. She had expected anger. She had expected violence. She had expected anything but this. Banishment. Exile. The ultimate punishment. The ultimate rejection. You can't, she whispered, her voice trembling, her body shaking. I am your grandmother. I am family. You were. Nico Lowe corrected her, his voice cold and implacable.
You forfeited that right.
When you betrayed me. When you betrayed us. He turned to Valeria, his eyes softening slightly, his gaze filled with gratitude, with love. Let's go, he said, his voice low. They left the room, leaving Nana Emilia alone with her shattered pride, with her broken power, with her regrets. The confrontation was over, but the consequences, the repercussions, were just beginning. Salvatore, and the other Capi, who had been secretly allied with Nana Emilia, made their move. They challenged Nicolo's authority, they questioned his decisions, they threatened his life. But Nicolo, with Valeria by his side, was prepared. He had anticipated their treachery, had planned for it, had fortified his position. He had the loyalty of the majority of the family, the support of the men who believed in him, who respected him, who feared him. The conflict was brief and brutal. There were skirmishes, there were threats, there were casualties. But in the end, Nicolo prevailed. Salvatore and his co-conspirators were defeated, their rebellion crushed, their power broken. Some were killed, others were imprisoned, others were banished. The Moretti family, purged of its dissenters, of its traitors, of its past, was once again united. Under Nicolo's leadership, under his new vision. And Valeria? She was by his side always. She was his confidant, his advisor, his lover. She was his strength, his compass, his redemption. She had helped him navigate the treacherous waters of his family's politics, had helped him expose his grandmother's treachery, had helped him crush the rebellion, had helped him save his soul. She had also, finally, found Marco. With Nicolo's help, with his connections, with his resources, she had located her brother, had ensured his safety, had arranged for his escape. He was far away, in a new country, with a new identity, with a new life. The reckoning was complete. The past had been confronted, the betrayals had been exposed, the wounds had begun to heal. And the redemption, not just of Nicolo, but of Valeria, of Marco, of the Moretti family, had begun. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape scarred but also cleansed. And in the aftermath, a new hope, a new future, a new love, had begun to bloom. The question remained if it could truly flourish in the soil from which it sprung. Chapter 19. Blood and Water. The dust settled, the immediate threats neutralized, but the underlying tension remained. The Moretti family, though outwardly unified under Nicolo's leadership, was still a simmering cauldron of old resentments, hidden agendas, and lingering doubts. The scars of the past, the betrayals, the lies, the violence, were not easily erased. Nicolo, with Valeria's support and counsel, embarked on a slow, painstaking process of reform, of transformation. He sought to modernize the family's operations, to move away from the traditional, brutal methods of the past, to embrace a more legitimate, less violent approach. He invested in new businesses, in technology, in education in the future. He sought to diversify the family's holdings, to reduce their reliance on illegal activities, to clean up their image. But it was a difficult uphill battle. The old guard, the men who had grown up in the traditional mafia world, resisted his changes, resented his reforms, questioned his strength. They saw his modernization as a weakness, his compassion as a flaw, his love for Valeria as a vulnerability. Valeria, despite the dangers, despite the constant threat of violence, remained steadfastly by Nicolo's side. She was his confidant, his advisor, his lover. She was his anchor, his compass, his conscience. She also became increasingly involved in the family's affairs, not in the illegal activities, but in the legitimate businesses, in the charitable foundations, in the social outreach programs. She used her skills, her intelligence, her compassion, to help those in need, to build bridges with the community, to repair the damage done by generations of violence and exploitation. She became a respected figure within the family, admired for her strength, her intelligence, her grace. She earned the loyalty of many of the younger members, the ones who were open to change, the ones who saw a different future. but she also made enemies. The old guard, the traditionalists, the ones who resented Niccolo's reforms, saw her as a threat, as an outsider, as a corrupting influence. They whispered about her. They plotted against her. They waited for an opportunity to strike. The opportunity came, as it always does, in an unexpected way. A rival family, the Castellanos, sensing weakness, sensing division within the Moretti ranks, made a move. They encroached on Moretti territory, they threatened Moretti businesses, they challenged Niccolo's authority. It was a calculated provocation, a test of Niccolo's resolve, a declaration of war. Niccolo, torn between his desire for peace, for reform, and his duty to protect his family, to defend his territory, to maintain his power, was forced to respond. He called a meeting of the capi, the lieutenants, the men who controlled the various factions within the family. He laid out the situation. He explained the threat. He asked for their support. But the support was not unanimous. The old guard, led by a man named Enzo, a cousin of Salvatore's, a man who had secretly harbored ambitions of taking over the family, challenged Niccolo. This weakness, Enzo said, his voice dripping with contempt, is your fault, Niccolo. Your reforms. Your sentimentality. Your obsession with this woman. He gestured towards Valeria, his eyes filled with hatred, with resentment. Valeria met his gaze, unflinching, her expression calm, her heart pounding in her chest. The Castellanos, they smell blood, Enzo continued. They see our division. They will not stop. Until they destroy us. We must respond. With force. With violence. With the old ways. Niccolo's face was a mask of fury, of conflict. He knew Enzo was right in a way. The Castellanos were a threat, a serious threat, and they needed to be dealt with. But he also knew that resorting to violence, to the old ways, would undermine everything he had been working towards, everything he had promised Valeria. There is another way, Valeria said, her voice clear and strong, her gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of each man in turn. We can negotiate. We can compromise. We can find a solution that does not involve bloodshed. The men, surprised by her intervention, by her audacity, fell silent. They looked at her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and grudging respect. The Castellanos, they are not unreasonable, Valeria continued. They want what we all want. Power, respect, security.
We can offer them that.
Without resorting to war. She outlined a plan, a strategy, a way to negotiate with the Castellanos, to offer them concessions, to appease them. It was a risky plan, a gamble, but it was also a chance. A chance to avoid bloodshed, a chance to break the cycle of violence. The capi, after a long, tense silence, began to debate, to argue, to consider her proposal. Some were skeptical, some were resistant, some were intrigued. Niccolo, watching Valeria, listening to her, felt a surge of pride, of admiration, of love. She was not just a beautiful woman, not just a compassionate woman, not just a lover. She was a strategist, a diplomat, a leader. In the end, after hours of heated discussion, the capi agreed. They would try Valeria's plan. They would negotiate with the Castellanos. They would seek peace. It was a victory, a small victory, but a significant one. Valeria had, once again, shown her strength, her intelligence, her influence. She had, once again, helped Niccolo, helped the family, helped change the course of their future. But the battle was far from over. The Castellanos were still a threat, Enzo and his followers were still a danger, and the old ways, the traditions of violence and betrayal, still lingered. Blood had been spilled, and more blood, inevitably, would follow. But perhaps, just perhaps, the tide was turning. Perhaps, with Valeria by his side, Niccolo could navigate the treacherous waters, could overcome the challenges, could build a new future, a future of peace, of prosperity, of love. The question was, could blood truly be overcome by water, by the cleansing power of change and forgiveness? Or would the stains of the past prove too deep, too indelible? Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Valeria's plan, though initially met with skepticism, proved surprisingly effective. The negotiations with the Castellanos, though tense and fraught with danger, yielded results. A truce was brokered, territories were redefined, concessions were made, and bloodshed was avoided. At least for the time being. Niccolo, emboldened by this success, continued his efforts to reform the family, to move away from the traditional, violent methods of the past, to embrace a more legitimate, less brutal approach. He faced resistance, he faced opposition, he faced threats. But he persevered, driven by his vision of a different future, driven by his love for Valeria, driven by his own conscience. Valeria, as always, was by his side, his confidant, his advisor, his partner. She was his strength, his compass, his inspiration. She was the bridge between the old world and the new, the mediator between tradition and progress, the embodiment of hope. But the enemies within, the old guard, the traditionalists, led by the resentful and ambitious Enzo, were not defeated. They were merely biding their time, waiting for an opportunity to strike, waiting for a chance to reclaim their power. The opportunity came, as it always does, in a way that was both unexpected and inevitable. A celebration, a feast, a gathering of the entire Moretti family to commemorate the truce with the Castellanos, to celebrate their newfound peace. It was a grand affair, held in the Palazzo Gardens, under the stars, with music, with dancing, with an abundance of food and wine. The atmosphere was festive, joyous, but beneath the surface, the tension simmered, the resentments festered, the plots were hatched. Valeria, dressed in a flowing gown of emerald green, her hair adorned with flowers, was radiant, beautiful, the center of attention. She moved through the crowd with grace and confidence, greeting guests, exchanging pleasantries, her eyes constantly searching for Niccolo, for any sign of danger. Niccolo, too, was watchful, alert, his senses heightened. He knew that this celebration was a risk, a vulnerability, a temptation for his enemies. He had taken precautions, he had increased security, he had warned his loyal men to be vigilant. But he also knew that he couldn't prevent every threat, couldn't anticipate every betrayal, couldn't control everything. He had to trust, to a certain extent, in the loyalty of his family, in the power of his leadership. As the evening progressed, as the wine flowed, as the music played, Valeria noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The smiles seemed forced, the laughter seemed strained, the tension seemed to thicken. She saw Enzo, whispering to his followers, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. She saw Nonna Emilia, who had been allowed to attend the celebration as a gesture of reconciliation, a decision Valeria had vehemently opposed, sitting alone, her face a mask of bitterness, of resentment. She felt a chill run down her spine, a premonition of danger, a sense of impending doom. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that something was about to happen. And then it did.
A scream, a shout, a gunshot.
Chaos erupted. Guests scattered, tables overturned, glasses shattered. Valeria, her heart pounding in her chest, searched frantically for Niccolo. She saw him, across the garden, struggling with Enzo, the two men locked in a brutal fight, their faces contorted with rage, with hatred. Enzo had a knife, a gleaming blade, and he was lunging at Niccolo, trying to kill him. Valeria, without hesitation, without thought for her own safety, ran towards them, her only thought to protect the man she loved. She reached them just as Enzo raised the knife, ready to plunge it into Niccolo's back. Valeria, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, threw herself in front of Niccolo, shielding him with her own body. The knife struck, not Niccolo, but Valeria. She felt a searing pain in her shoulder, a sharp, agonizing stab, and she stumbled, falling to the ground, her vision blurring, her body numb. Niccolo, seeing Valeria fall, seeing the blood staining her dress, roared with a fury that shook the very foundations of the palazzo. He disarmed Enzo with a swift, brutal movement, knocking him to the ground, his face contorted with rage, with grief. He knelt beside Valeria, his hands trembling, his eyes filled with terror, with despair. "Valeria!" he cried, his voice hoarse, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Valeria, stay with me, please stay with me." Valeria, her vision fading, her body weakening, reached out, her hand touching his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his cheek, her touch gentle, loving, forgiving. "Nico Lo," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her breath shallow. I love you." Her eyes closed, her hand fell limp, her body still. Nico Lo, holding her in his arms, felt his world shatter, his heart break, his soul die. He had lost her, the woman he loved, the woman who had saved him, the woman who had changed him. But had he? As the chaos continued around him, as his men subdued Enzo and his followers, as the sounds of sirens filled the air, Nico Lo felt a faint pulse beneath his fingers, a flicker of life, a glimmer of hope. Valeria was not dead. She was alive, but barely. The final confrontation was not one of death, but of the ultimate test of their love, of their loyalty, of their future. The hearts and loyalties of everyone present were laid bare, and the consequences, the scars, would remain forever. The question now was, would she survive? And if she did, what would become of them? The future, once again, was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Their lives were irrevocably changed. Epilogue. Valeria survived. The wound, though serious, had missed any vital organs. She spent weeks in the hospital, hovering between life and death, her body fighting to recover, her spirit sustained by Nico Lo's unwavering presence, by his constant vigil at her bedside. He never left her, not for a moment. He slept in a chair beside her bed. He held her hand. He whispered words of love, of encouragement, of hope. He willed her to live. He prayed for her recovery. He bargained with fate. And she, slowly, painstakingly, began to heal. The wound closed, the pain subsided, the strength returned. She opened her eyes, she spoke, she smiled. She lived. The recovery was long and arduous, but Valeria was strong, resilient, determined. She had faced death, and she had won. She had stared into the abyss, and she had returned. And Nico Lo?
He was changed.
The near loss of Valeria had shaken him to his core, had stripped away the last vestiges of his cold, ruthless persona, had revealed the man beneath, the man who loved, the man who cared. He doubled down on his efforts to reform the family, to move away from violence, to embrace a more legitimate, less brutal path. He faced opposition, he faced resistance, he faced threats. But he persevered, driven by his love for Valeria, driven by his vision of a different future, driven by his own redemption. Enzo was imprisoned, his followers dispersed, his power broken. Nana Emilia, stripped of her influence, of her authority, of her family, was exiled to a remote villa in the countryside, alone, forgotten, her legacy tarnished. Marco remained in hiding, safe, but forever separated from his sister, from his past. He sent letters, occasional messages, expressing his gratitude, his regret, his love. And Valeria and Nico Lo? They built a life together, a life of love, of companionship, of purpose. They left the Palazzo Moretti, with its dark history, its shadowed secrets, its memories of pain and betrayal. They moved to a smaller villa, overlooking the sea, a place of peace, of tranquility, of healing. They continued to be involved in the family's affairs, but from a distance, guiding, advising, supporting, but not controlling. They focused on the legitimate businesses, on the charitable foundations, on giving back to the community. They traveled, they explored, they lived. They embraced life. They cherished every moment. They loved each other fiercely, passionately, completely. They never forgot the past. The scars remained. The memories lingered. But they didn't let it define them. They learned from it. They grew from it. They transcended it. They had children, a son and a daughter, children who grew up in a world of peace, of security, of love. Children who knew nothing of the violence, the betrayals, the darkness that had shaped their parents' lives. And so, the story of Valeria Marchesi, the simple seamstress from Trastevere, and Niccolò Moretti, the ruthless mafia don, ended not in tragedy, not in despair, but in hope. A hope born of love, of sacrifice, of redemption. A hope for a future free from the shadows of the past, a future filled with light, with laughter, with love. A future they had built, together, brick by brick, scar by scar, love by love. Their love story, born in the heart of the mafia, became a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, the transformative power of love, and the possibility of redemption. Even in the darkest of worlds, light could be found. Even in the most hardened of hearts, love could bloom. Even among blood and water,